Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Assassin's Creed Revelations for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. This is an action-adventure game and the sequel to Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. It was developed by Ubisoft and released in November of 2011 for consoles and then later on for PC. And it's kind of interesting because this is pretty much where public opinion turned against the Assassin's Creed series. And that begs the question of why, because Assassin's Creed 2 in particular was really well received, and Brotherhood was well received. But what was it so much about Revelations that put fans off? Well, as far as presentation goes, it's pretty much what you've come to expect from the Assassin's Creed series up to this point. Namely, the presentation is very well done. Even to this day, the graphics actually look pretty good, and when it was released, obviously it looked way better. And the fact that they were able to render all of this on the previous gen of consoles is very impressive. Now that said, there are some issues that have resulted from it aging. Namely, the textures don't look as good as they used to. Some of the lip syncing isn't as good as it might have been back in the day. And, of course, some of the modeling looks a bit blockier than we'd like in this day and age. But that said, the sheer amount of detail in the environments, the amount of people on screen at any given time, is staggering. And it is a joy to wander around the city. In this particular case, you're wandering around Constantinople. And it's just this painstakingly recreated version that is wonderful to wander around in. It feels like a living, breathing city, even though you don't really get to interact with all that much. And that's one thing that the Assassin's Creed series has always done phenomenally. They've made these settings just come to life. And this one's no exception. And likewise, the sound design is very well done. You have some very nice sound effects, a lot of which are pretty beefy, and some voice acting that ranges from extremely well done to not quite as well done, but hamming it up enough that it still gives the game some charm. Although, in certain parts, you really do feel like some of the actors are just kind of phoning their voiceovers in, and that will come in more when I get into the story and the gameplay part of this. But for now, just know that the voiceovers are good for the most part, but occasionally they step a bit into the more mediocre territory. Occasionally. And then, of course, there's the music, which is just as good as it's ever been. So they've done a very good job with the presentation, and it still holds up very well. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that, once again, you're playing as Desmond Miles, and more specifically, you're playing as his ancestors being relived through the Animus. In this particular case, Ezio Auditore da Firenze, as you were in the previous two Assassin's Creed games, and Altair, oddly enough. So you go back to Altair's history after the events of the first game, and it's basically the stupidest story setup they could have imagined. Desmond is now in a coma following events in the previous game, and he has to go through the Animus and through his ancestors' memories in order to basically piece together his brain. It's incredibly stupid, but as far as the memories you're going through are concerned, you're basically playing as Ezio following in the footsteps of Altair, trying to find what Altair left behind. Which means that you basically need to go find a bunch of MacGuffins in order to be able to open the library and find out what it was Altair was hiding. Of course, the game says they're keys, not MacGuffins, but that's exactly what they are. MacGuffins. And the plot itself is really not all that interesting. I mean, it wasn't all that interesting in the previous games either, but at least when you were running around as Ezio, for example, you got to see more of him as a character, you got to see him doing things as a character, not just this kind of pawn in the Assassin's Creed storyline, and it flowed more naturally. This time around, it feels like they just slapped the story together to have a justification for whatever happens in Assassin's Creed 3. And that's where things really get nasty with this game. It's a transition piece between Assassin's Creed Brotherhood and Assassin's Creed 3. In other words, it's basically filler. There's not a lot in this game that is really important to the overall Assassin's Creed storyline. And As a result, it feels like you're just going through the motions again. And it really doesn't help that the gameplay is almost unchanged from the previous game. They did add in a couple of things. They did tweak a few things. For example, you now have a hook blade, which allows you to perform some extra maneuvers. Nothing that's particularly great to have, but it's just a few extra moves that, if you feel like it, you can use. They also added in the ability to throw grenades, basically, of varying kinds, whether they be the straight up just lethal kind, or they be useful in that you can trick enemies into thinking they're wounded, or to distract them and lead them away from where you're going, and things like that. So you can craft these by going to all over the city and just finding chests full of crafting materials. And then you go to a crafting table and you craft them in incredibly simplistic menu form. It's really easy, and frankly, there's not really much that these add to the game. If anything, it just kind of feels like a bit of a hindrance. And so when you go into the rest of the newer mechanics, things like defending the assassin dens with a tower defense mini-game, you start to see the problem that really manifested itself later on in this series, which is that after Brotherhood, the series started struggling with its core identity. See, Assassin's Creed 1 was a very cut and dry game. Assassin's Creed 2 just took what that did, expanded upon it, made it better. Brotherhood introduced some extra mechanics that were basically just what you would find in a Flash game. And while it didn't feel wildly out of place because they did justify it with the whole Brotherhood thing, it still was kind of contrived and could have been done a lot better. This basically just takes what Brotherhood did, throws in a tower defense minigame, throws in a couple of extra gadgets to fiddle around with, and really not much else. They even modified the Eagle Vision mechanic to basically just make it a less useful version of Batman Arkham Asylum's detective mode. It just feels like a rehash of Assassin's Creed Brotherhood in terms of its gameplay. Now, that's not to say that the gameplay is bad. It's as good as it was in Brotherhood, which means that it's okay. But therein lies the problem. The gameplay is not enough to elevate this thing past its story problems. It feels like a transition piece, and unlike, say, Mass Effect 2, which is also a transition piece, it doesn't have enough in the game to really keep you interested. You feel bored right from the very beginning. And throughout playing this thing, I just kept going, why am I playing this? It feels pointless. There's only a handful of plot points that really matter to the actual Assassin's Creed plotline, and the rest of it just feels like filler. And honestly, I don't really like the Assassin's Creed gameplay all that much. It's okay, but the game is way too damn easy. It's a matter of spamming the counter button, and thus you win every single fight. There's really no effort put into it. I go on autopilot during the fights, I can completely screw around and still manage to come out without a scratch. It doesn't make any sense. The only thing they did to try to make it a bit more difficult is they threw in a lot more enemies with guns, which in turn means that they can hit you from quite a distance and spot you from quite a distance. And unfortunately for the game, it doesn't actually make it more difficult, it just makes it annoying. Because they're still just as easy to deal with as they have always been. It's just that they'll be a bit harder to access, so instead of just going up and shanking them, you basically just throw a throwing knife at them, or you just shoot them. And then you're good to go. The only real challenge in this game comes from getting the controls to do exactly what you want them to do when you're doing the platforming segments. And that's kinda it. Ultimately, the problem becomes this. Revelations is just Brotherhood done all over again with a couple of extra things tacked on that really don't add much to the game. In fact, in some cases, like the tower defense, they straight up take away from it. The tower defense is not fun, and tower defense never has been fun. It's just yet another thing they tacked onto the game, just to have something different. And with the multiplayer not being playable anymore because nobody's playing this thing, they moved on to other games, there's frankly not much reason to play Revelations. It's not an outright bad game, but it's the kind of mediocre that you can just skip entirely. And ultimately, the only people who can really get the most out of Revelations are people who are already fans of Assassin's Creed to begin with. People who just want the complete story and love the gameplay already. If you're someone like me and you don't really have that much of an interest in the Assassin's Creed series, just kind of a passing interest, where 2 was good and Brotherhood was okay, I mean, it felt kind of stale at that point, but it was okay, you're probably not going to get much out of it. Especially if you played both Assassin's Creed 2 and Brotherhood prior to this. Especially Brotherhood. And yet, Brotherhood still feels like it actually has a proper place in the series. It didn't feel like a complete waste of time. This does. I can really only recommend this to die-hard Assassin's Creed fans. If you're anyone else, I would avoid it. Ultimately, it can be skipped. There's not really all that much in the plot that's here that couldn't be summarized in a few minutes in Assassin's Creed 3. I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.